No matter who you are or where you go, heading outside even for a few minutes is always worth it. I'm your host, Amy Bouchatz, and here at Humans Outside, we're using the Humans Outside 365 Challenge to build a life around spending time in nature while hearing from fascinating outdoor-minded guests. As a journalist for 19 years, I've let curiosity be my guide. After my husband's injuries from military service, we started looking for a better way to live. That's why we moved sight unseen to Alaska to see if an outdoor-focused life was the answer. Since September 2017, I've personally spent at least 20 consecutive minutes outside every single day, no matter what, to explore how nature can change my life. Ready to hear from experts and outdoor lovers who make heading into nature just a part of who they are while we work to do the same? Let's go! If you're someone who loves to travel and are always finding a reason for the next adventure far from home, you might be surprised by how rewarding staying and exploring the minutiae around you can be. For my part, in a place as vast as where I live in Alaska, it feels like all the time in the world and all the days of exploration I could possibly have in my life will never be enough to see and experience everything this land has to offer. For some people, the good things about staying put are best highlighted by doing the opposite, and they are takeaways we could all use to really appreciate the world in which we live. Today's guest, John Messick, has personally explored the power of global travel before finally planting his feet in Alaska. A teacher, writer, and father, he is an assistant professor of writing at Kenai Peninsula College and the author of the new book, Compass Lines, a collection of essays that explore the paths we take toward belonging through the lens of life lived through world travel. In this episode, John will talk about what he learned about the power of place through his travels, the importance of belonging, and how you can find that too, no matter where your adventures lead you. John, welcome to Humans Outside.
Hi, glad to be here.
Well, I'm so excited to talk to you today about travel. I so enjoyed your collections of essays about this. We start all of our episodes imagining ourselves in our guests' favorite outdoor spaces if we're just hanging out, chatting somewhere outdoors that you love. So if that was true, where would we be with you today?
So if we were talking about the book that I just published, I think probably the most powerful Alaskan space that I write about in there is Bremner Mining District, which is up in the Wrangels. And I'd want to say that is the space that when I really think about a powerful wilderness experience, that's probably the most powerful wilderness experience I have in recent memory. I think about the way in which, as we get older and life events kind of change who we are. That one marks the end of this book, and it really it marks my transition from vagabond into fatherhood, as it were. And so it's a place that I traveled to. I was fortunate enough to spend almost 7 weeks out there, 6 weeks and some change with my wife while she was 4 months pregnant with our first child in 2019. And we were mostly in an alpine fairyland on the far eastern slab of the Chugach with peaks all around that you could climb up to and just get views to wherever, saw as many bears as we did people kind of place. So I want to imagine that as maybe the initial place, but, and there's always a but to these things, but it's remote, it's hard to get to, it's inaccessible, and I think that more philosophically, as I think about that as a transition place that I'd like to talk to you from, but really, I just kinda want the snow to be gone right now. I want the lakes to open up, and as a father of 2 now, I wanna get out with my kids into the lake systems, and so down here on the Kenai, we have the Swan Lakes and Swanson River lake systems, which are kind of a little unknown gem down here as part of the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, and I cannot wait to get out to those and listen to loon calls and swat mosquitoes with my 3-year-old and take my daughter on what will actually be her first overnight canoe trip. So I'm really looking forward to doing that sometime if this ice ever melts.
Well, it won't be long between when we're recording this and when people hear this. But things change fast here in Alaska, so maybe it'll be gone by then. Maybe these future dreams will have already come true, because that's beautifully how seasons work. And I just put my faith in that because at the time that we're recording this, it snowed all day yesterday, and that's not okay with me anymore. So
Well, but Alaska doesn't get springtime, right?
No.
So
Nope.
we sort of just make that giant leap of faith into high summer right away. So,
Yes.
we have that to look forward to.
Yes, and trusting that will happen. So, John, why don't you first talk to us about how you became somebody who likes to go outside?
I've always been someone who likes to go outside. I don't know, I guess for some people it's a matter of discovering a key moment. I'm not sure I really have one particular outdoor experience that I can relate to. My dad was really big into outdoor experiences growing up in Wisconsin. He had grown up in Minnesota, and so the Boundary Waters canoe area there stands as kind of it's an iconic place for people from Minnesota to travel to by canoe. So I grew up in canoes. I grew up on bicycles. I have always loved bicycling and canoeing. I think are probably the two greatest achievements that humans have accomplished. Really, we've devolved since the bicycle was invented 125 or so years ago. We had achieved everything we needed to when we had trains and bicycles, and the car really just screws everything up. So I would say I've kind of always been an outdoor person. If that ever became formalized somewhere, it would, I was involved in the Scouts for a long time, though have not had much to do with that as an adult. And I did do a lot of adventures in that way. But it's always been part of me. I think if there's a moment when I can really think about how my imagination of what outdoor experience was and how it kind of blew my world up, I took a job between my junior and senior year of college building trails in the Pacific Northwest. I flew out to Eugene, Oregon, and worked on a trail building crew as a well, first as a trainee and then later as a crew leader, bouncing around in 15 passenger vans through the Sawtooth Wilderness of Idaho, the Frank Church Wilderness, remote wilderness locations in the Cascades, Washington, Oregon, all over the place, old growth forests, big, forgotten Idaho peaks, some of the last really contiguous wild areas in the lower 48, places where there were still grizzly bears, places where there were wolves, and places where the trees were still, big around as houses. And that really shifted what it felt like wilderness was possible for me to be. I'd grown up, again, I talk about the Boundary Waters. I talked about a lot of Midwestern adventures, but suddenly returning home for my senior year of college, it just felt like those Midwestern wilderness spaces suddenly seemed really small. Suddenly, the scope of getting out and seeing new things, it felt like I could go anywhere at that point, and so that was a huge moment, and I sort of found the job randomly. It was a mentor I had at a at the college I was going to in Central Missouri, and he said, "I did this a long time ago. You should go out and do it." And I did, and, I worked trail and built trail for a few years. After that, in Compass Lines, I talk about fighting fire, and that came out of the trail building work as well, but none of those things were things I even imagined before kind of taking that college summer job. So the shift from wilderness being a place you go to escape, to wilderness being a lifestyle, to wilderness actually not really being wilderness at all, but to just being something you call home, and the conception of wilderness, the realization of how modern of a concept that actually is, that all really started with that first summer out west building trails.
Yeah, you're making me think about this idea that wilderness is, well, it's something that we have a construct around, right? We have defined what that means to the American psyche, but that it can actually be something else or something individualized to each person. That my wilderness and your wilderness don't have to look the way they do on a postcard. That this can be almost a marrying of nearby nature with this concept of being of wild, right? That in that word, that this is open to interpretation by each person. And it's one of these beautiful things that nature is great at, right? That as being and fitting whatever it is you're looking for in it, it has that to offer.
Yeah. I mean, I hesitate to even use the word wilderness anymore, and it feels to me more like a political designation than it does an actual space. There's a lot that's been written about it. I think it's William Cronon has an essay from the late 90s, The Trouble with Wilderness, I think it's called, that talks about it a lot. But I think for me in Compass Lines, I have a section called Learn the Flowers, and it really recounts my first encounter with the North and then tracks my way into Dr. Alan Boris, who was an anthropologist for almost 50 years down on the Kenai Peninsula and a very dear friend who passed away in 2019. And he always talked about, instead of wilderness, it was place. And some of those ideas came out of the realization that wilderness is it depends on having places that are not wilderness. I have a moment when I was on the McKinsey River. I was 24 years old, and we ran across a group of moose hunters while we were floating the river. My friend Wade and I had decided the summer before, when we were fighting fire, that floating a river in the north looked great. So we pulled out an atlas, found a big, thick blue line, floated it. We didn't want the Yukon because that was too popular, right? This was the world I was inhabiting in my head at that point, the sort of bold, young, macho idea. Like, I want somewhere more remote than that. And so I thought the McKinsey would be the place. And I didn't know the names of any other rivers. So we're floating down, and this group came up to us, and they were probably 40 miles downstream from their village, and it was probably another, almost 100 miles to the next village, and they didn't have enough gas to get home. And I remember they had an elder among them, and he wasn't really concerned at all. And he just kind of waved his hand out and said, like, "We'll stay here. This is home." Was the idea behind that this isn't any more wilderness to the original inhabitants, the folks whose knowledge of this landscape, of any landscape, extends back in terms of first occupancy. It that's not something they really think of as a wilderness. They think of it as home. It's where you live, it's where you inhabit. Um, no more wild than a cornfield in Iowa. And so, I try to remember that. I still am very white about those things. I still want the untouched. I still think about that idea of untouched landscapes, but Alaska's not an untouched place, not at all. And if anything, like, we're not a frontier either. Our definitions of ourselves and the way we think about the rhetoric of this place as beautiful untouched landscape or eternal frontier, it it leaves home out of that conversation. And I'm new here, right? I'll always be new here for as long as I'm here. Most of us will be if we don't go back multiple generations. And so I think we have a responsibility to think about how that conception of place really
Sure.
works.
And I wonder if that's not highlighted by traveling worldwide like you've done. That no matter where you go, it is unknown to you and it is a destination, but it is home and known and used by somebody else, by the people who are there, and that you will only ever be a tourist in those locations. And there's maybe an ethos there, an ethic involved with how you treat and how you approach those things as a tourist.
Yeah, absolutely. We have this idea, I think, particularly from a literary perspective, we have this idea that there are travelers and there are tourists. And the traveler is somehow above the tourist because they don't stay in sandals resorts. And that's ludicrous, right? They're Just because they read the books about a place and studied the politics of a place so that they could write about it more effectively doesn't necessarily mean that they are suddenly residents of that location. And that has been a huge shaper of why I've stayed in Alaska in general. The summer before I came up here, this is more than 10 years ago now, I was in the Middle East, and I bicycled from Istanbul to Damascus. This was just a few months before the Arab Spring and war broke out, and I don't recommend anyone who's planning a trip to try that particular route now, but at the time, there was a pretty good level of safety for that, and I was much younger and a little bit more I believed a little more that my own boldness would keep me safe from pretty much anything. I'd been traveling for a long time, and I had encountered story after story of just surreal experiences of kindness, and so I had a lot of faith that a trip like that was doable, and it was. I didn't have a single I encountered some of the friendliest people ever, but then when the war broke out just a few months after I left, looking back at the pictures I'd taken then and going back through my journal, which I'd been writing about this idea of the exotic and how deep it felt for me to walk through Damascus and see 6,000-year-old civilization built on top of itself, on top of itself, on top of itself, on top of itself. I mean, you have dozens of different, not just like nations, but languages and cultures built all on top of each other in the same place for, you know, as long as places have been built. And I felt this connection, and then suddenly I didn't. Suddenly, yes, that is a shared human history, but I was born into a colonizing culture. I was born into a place that won't understand that kind of length back. My ancestors left their homeland. That's not traceable for me. We came to someone else's home and settled here. And so suddenly I had this sort of loss of grounding. What I'd believed I'd experienced in terms of friendliness was, what was it? I still don't have an answer to really what that was, and I won't deny that I experienced incredible kindness and met incredible people and saw beautiful landscapes during that trip, but, when a war goes through, even if I wasn't there to witness that violence, knowing that it happened on top of a place I'd been felt felt like I'd somehow trespassed on somebody else's reality, and I wonder just how far to take that sometimes in terms of should I not travel at all? Should I accept that I'm a tourist? And if so, how does one become a tourist more responsibly? I think it's probably the responsibility of tourists to encounter a place with eyes open. And maybe that's part of what keeps me in Alaska. The nature of tourism here offers this kind of a constant influx of people who ask the usual silly tourist questions, and feeling like a constant tourist forces me to always walk through Alaska with my eyes a little bit more open if I want to live here ethically.
How many countries have you visited? Like give people a sense of how much travel you've actually done.
I don't know, somewhere in the 30s, something like that. I'd have to, use more than my fingers and toes, I think. Though in terms of places that I really spent a lot of time in, I lived in South Korea for a year after I graduated college teaching there. So that would be a place where I can really say that I lived. And I don't know if Antarctica counts as a country, but I did spend a summer season in Antarctica. It's it's such a weird place because nobody owns it. It's really truly the only place that is untouched by humans mostly, and really, there's a reason for that. We have no business being there. It's much more akin to the moon. If the far north of Alaska and Prudhoe and the North Slope is something we're calling inhospitable, then this is the North Slope on steroids down there. I mean, it's really pretty powerful
Mm.
to spend a season in a place like that.
Hey humans, just a quick break to remind you that if you want to build your own outdoor habit, the Humans Outside 365 Challenge is a great way to get started. Cool and exclusive challenge swag, including a finisher medal and a decal, is waiting for you. All you need to do is visit humansoutside.com/challenge. Don't get left out. Go to humansoutside.com/challenge to learn more now. Okay, back to the show. So before you settled in Alaska, and tell us, how long have you been in Alaska now? How long have you just been home?
I have almost 14 years, give or
So
take.
before you came up here and decided you were done globetrotting, what were you looking for when you were doing this? What were you hoping to find? Because this is not just like, I think I'll go to the Bahamas for a vacation. This is a much different thing than that. So what were you looking for?
Can I read a section of
Yeah.
my book? I think I will not say it as succinctly as I wrote it and edited it for half a decade, in working on this essay. So, it starts with a guy, George Alfred Townsend, who was a journalist during the Civil War, and he I randomly encountered him when Molly and I were hiking the Appalachian Trail after we finished grad school in Fairbanks, which is where I first lived when I really moved to Alaska and settled here. Fell in love with Molly up there. We headed south for a while to hike the Appalachian Trail. In part, that was what we were down there for. And we came across this like huge estate in Maryland, which is a state park now called Gathland. And this was just a wonderful quote from this war journalist. And apparently they paid journalists back then because he had enough money for an estate.
Is this the place with? This is the place. He's got like a monument there. It's like out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, yeah, it's, like, right next to one of the Washington monuments and stuff. I mean, it's not the Washington Monument, but there are apparently several Washington monuments in the Washington, DC,
Yeah.
Maryland, Virginia kind of
And
corner
this is like
there.
off a highway
Yeah,
in the
so
middle of up in Maryland, right? I think I've been there by accident.
I mean, possibly. We hiked in off the
Yeah.
trail, so I don't really know how to get there by
Yeah.
road. Probably never
Yeah.
will.
This is one of those places when you encounter this on the road for listeners. This is one of those places that you're probably not going there on purpose. It's just sort of like you're
Yeah,
like, what in the
yeah.
world is this monument to this Civil War reporter doing here? There you go. I'm sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, I mean, and there's like a house and kind of like a manicured lawn, and it's, a little interpretive center, and I had never heard of him before, but he said this. He said, "I took 8 years at least, if not 12, out of my life and invested it in experience, saving nothing, but going many a thousand miles, that I might learn how to see. For the eye is to the writer what the hand is to the mechanic." And I love that quote. So I went on actually in trying to kind of articulate this very question in the book. I said, if you'd asked me back then, when I was about 22, what I was looking for, I might have told you I wanted to peer underneath the shiny advertisements and the perfect postcards. If I was a few beers into the night, I might have said I was trying to find a place where I felt like I fit in, though I doubt I could have explained what that really meant. But ask me today, in all those months on the backpacker trail, studying the Lonely Planet shoestring guide like a Bible, did I really learn some deep truth about my place in the world? Mostly, I was just another drunk kid on holiday looking for a good story to tell the folks back home. I'm not sure I have an actual adequate answer. The older I get and the more I think about why I was doing those things, the less certain I am that I was in it for the adventure and not running away. And I can't say for certain what it was I was running away from. Cornfields, maybe. I don't really love cornfields all that much, so that could be it. But also, I think I believed very much in a narrative where as a white man going somewhere, going anywhere was possible. I had always had this obsession with travel writing, really loved travel writers. Even as a kid, I my favorite stories were Jack London. They were the stories of people well before that. I liked to read Arctic explorers, Shackleton, and then some of the colonizing folks from the 1600s. I mean, I still like reading the weird journals of, French Canadian voyageurs and stuff. And so I really saw the adventure of going somewhere unique, going somewhere strange as something I should do if I really wanted to see the world. I wanted to push boundaries. And, at some point, it wasn't that I was pushing, crazy boundaries. I wasn't going and climbing Everest. I did a few things that were a little silly on a bicycle, but people have done far sillier things on bicycles than anything I ever did. People have done far sillier things on unicycles for that matter. And there's a moment in I don't do you know Werner Herzog, the filmmaker? He did Grizzly Man, and he's done a bunch of documentary films, and one of the films he did was on an Antarctic arts grant, and he documented all of the people at McMurdo Station and some of the different research projects that were down there, and the big question he was asking was, what is it that draws people to a place like Antarctica? What is it that draws people to these kinds of extremes? And he has this scene with a guy who was trying to set a Guinness World Record on every continent. And so he went somewhere and he bounced on a pogo stick for several days in Asia, and I don't did somersaults for multiple miles in South America, whatever it was. And so he was going down to Antarctica specifically to set, I don't remember what the world record was, but to set a world record on the seventh continent. And the narrative really laid bare how absolutely silly some of these extreme ideas are. I mean, yes, it's great. On my honeymoon, we were floating the Yukon River for 3 weeks, and there was a French Canadian guy who was apparently swimming the river somewhere near us, which is cool. I mean, good on him. That's really awesome that you swam the Yukon River. You are the first, probably the only, to do that, so you can say that. But in the end, to what purpose to do those things? I have a great respect for the superhuman feats of strength, but I think I have greater respect for the, the little old ladies in rural Alaska who season after season still go to fish camp and cut fish, for people who stay in their community and do the brave thing of fighting for making a better community, even if the politics are against them, even if the economy is against them. That feels to me far braver than going out and trying to traverse the Brooks Range in a week on foot.
Can you give 3 or 4 tips to anyone who's maybe looking to find that sense of place and that connection, that cultural connection, and that dwelling in a single place to looking for that grounding? How should they go about feeling that connection? What do they need to do to find it?
I think there's an old John Prine song about it. Something like blow up your TV, move to the country, get a garden, grow a lot of peaches, something like
Peaches
that.
sound good.
But no, I for me at least, having kids has been the most difficult and life-changing thing I've ever done. I absolutely love my children, but the scope of what I envision and imagine being able to do has changed so much in that regard. My 3-year-old doesn't need to go so far past the end of the driveway to feel the kind of connection to place, and for me, I'm going stir crazy just a day at home. I wanna get out and I wanna hike and I wanna drive for an hour to somewhere to hike, and really just a walk through your neighborhood is a good start. I don't know. I think about this with bicycling because I love wilderness. I really do. But I also think that some of the most powerful traveling that I did was in places where there are people. My dad, my parents live in very much in the country, and my dad absolutely is obsessed with city hiking. Whenever he goes somewhere, he doesn't really have any interest anymore at his age, he's almost 70, to really get into the wilderness and go explore the wilderness, and I hear a similar sentiment among folks who you read about who have hiked the Appalachian Trail and done the Triple Crown of through hiking and are just the prolific walkers. And when you read about these individuals, there's a great book by Robert Moore called On Trails. They describe the experience of hiking these long distance trails as the green tunnel. And many of the sort of obsessive walkers, people who walk for their life, the Forrest Gump sort of archetype, end up walking on roads. And that's a very different experience. It's a different way of envisioning what your community looks like. Walk down the main street in Palmer or walk from Palmer down to the hospital sometime and then still try and, want to drive around in a lifted pickup truck that's, rolling coal, as it were. When you hear that noise and you experience that speed from the pace of a person walking on the side of it, it does change your perspective. So, you don't have to get into the wilderness. Uh, it might not be the most pleasant thing in the world, but there is a lot of power if you're willing to open your eyes and be present. It opens your eyes to a lot of things too. I think it opens your eyes to more than just, um, this place. It also opens your eyes to the kind of infrastructure and communities that we're inhabiting.
Sure. John, as a final thing, would you mind walking us out describing one of your favorite outdoor moments? Maybe just something that you think about if you close your eyes and think about somewhere you just love to be and something you just want to harken back to. Where are you and what are you doing?
When my son was just learning to talk, maybe 18 months old, it was late fall, late summer kind of time. And we would go a couple times a week to the Salteshi Trail system, which is right between Kenai and Soldotna, just off the highway. Uh, Beautifully laid out ski trail system, and not anything super special. And for reasons that involve my own hyperactivity and inborn silliness, two words that I had taught him, I was trying to teach him how to say shred the narnar. I really wanted him to be a ski bum temporarily. And he would run down the trail in front of me, just running little toddler fashion through the woods, and I have these cell phone videos of the leaves just starting to change, running on what looks, it's right off the highway, but it looks, like the wilderness you envision, and it's very familiar feeling to me, just shouting sick nar nar," with such joy and abandon. I guess if you'd asked me this before I'd had kids, I would have had, like, a probably a really intense, very macho moment involving surviving rapids or, you know, careening down a hill on a bicycle outside of Costa Rica, but that's the moment that I come back to again and again. I am just outside. I am not necessarily doing something that is so intense, that is trying to really prove to myself or to the world that I can do this super hard thing. I've done those things, some of them, but it's a moment where I can witness joy, feel it in myself despite the busyness of a day, be somewhere close, be somewhere connected, and just be present in that moment with the sick narnar screaming of a little kid.
John, thank you so much for joining us on Humans Outside today. So appreciate your time and work.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad you liked the book, so I hope some of your listeners will check it out as well. I really appreciate these conversations and hope that some of the writing I've done as well can further them.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of Humans Outside. Help me out by leaving a 5-star rating or review wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help other listeners find the podcast too. Now, go get outside. Until next time, we'll see you out there.